Many times in fiction, that age-old question is posed about man becoming endowed with superhuman abilities. How does one juxtapose humanity and godlike powers? If you've read stories of mythology, you'll know that downfall of such beings are usually attributed to their very human weaknesses, such as greed and fear. Because there's no escape from what lies deep within our psyches. Even Odin, the wisest of the Norse gods, gave into fear and tricked Fenrir into being bound because he believed he would become too powerful, thus creating a powerful enemy who would have otherwise been an ally. And how did that work out for Odin during Ragnarok? In the case of Spider-Man, we have a tale that, much like those mythological stories, puts its own spin on the question of a human becoming endowed with fantastic abilities. Only instead of becoming power-hungry, Spider-Man takes it upon himself to use his powers to the utmost level of being responsible and maintaining that delicate balance between good and evil. And yet, at the heart of his being, he's still Peter Parker, a high school kid carrying enough baggage to fill an airport. How does a lifetime of being the emotionally repressed king of the losers club mix with the after effects of a radioactive spider bite? Sometimes the subconscious can cause us to self-sabotage ourselves in very creative ways. That's what we'll be talking about on this episode of the Story Detective. Don't move. Becoming Spider-Man was initially like hitting the lottery for Peter. For a short time, he moved past all the day-to-day problems of his life, even going so far as to create a costume and an alter ego. He was reinventing himself to become a star. Putting on a mask, he attended a wrestling match, where a cash prize would be awarded for anyone who stayed in the ring with the champ. Peter used his newfound abilities to make sure he won the cash to further his career. But when it came down to collecting, the wrestler's manager didn't pay up. The box office was robbed that same night, and the robber ran past Peter in the hall while the manager yelled, "Stop that thief!" Peter, still angry from getting ripped off, said, "Sorry, not my problem." This, of course, is the same thief who burgled the home of Aunt May and Uncle Ben, and his uncle surprised the burglar. Peter is slapped back to reality with a gigantic load of guilt. With his uncle's words, "With great power comes great responsibility," stamping itself like a scarlet letter across the totality of his existence. He tracks down the burglar as Spider-Man, but the price for his moment of stepping outside of the responsible kid who's been treated like a loser has been paid in kind. The serious kid with the weight of the world on his shoulders emerges once again, because we can't escape from who we are deep down inside, even after a radioactive spider bite. What happens next reads like a Freudian textbook. Remember what we talked about concerning backstory, everything that happened to the character before the current story began, forming the interior landscape? Those inner demons do more than just roll around inside the character's head causing emotional trauma. They also project. Everything points at the core story and defines it, because the exterior is a reflection of the interior. In other words, what we think and feel and believe strongly about ourselves eventually becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. In fiction, however, the prophecy is fulfilled very symbolically. Fiction is, after all, a semblance of life, and that semblance carries its lessons for both character and reader vicariously. Providing a vicarious experience is essentially the emotional core of any story, and a guy wearing a Spider-Man costume has to deliver on that emotional subconscious level. Let's see how Stan Lee and Steve Ditko serve this up to their readers. Peter is still in high school, following the path of the science geek and loser. He doesn't use his abilities to his advantage. He still lets the bullies pick on him during the day, but goes out after school and patrols the city looking to help people. He's not only taking responsibility for having been given great powers, but Peter Parker becomes a constant sacrifice on the altar of Spider-Man's responsibilities. Peter finally gets a date. He stands her up because somebody's in trouble. Peter has final exams. He misses them because Spider-Man is needed. Peter is sacrificed every time he puts on that mask. Guilt can be a powerful motivator, but it starts to look as if he's punishing himself under the guise of being responsible. Peter's mettle was tested, and he was found unworthy. This is further proved on his day job as a freelance photographer for the Daily Bugle, a job he gets because publisher J. Jonah Jameson is willing to pay for photos of Spider-Man. Peter decides he's not above cheating his competition by providing the photos and getting on the Bugle's payroll. Good characters aren't perfect. They all have their flaws, bad habits, even occasionally do things that aren't so nice. These imperfections make them more believable. And here's where things really get interesting. Jameson, once he has the photos, launches a campaign against Spider-Man. He's depicted as a public menace, a dangerous character who has a hidden agenda. This undermines everything Peter is working for. But does he stop providing photos to his publisher? Nope. He keeps them coming. Jameson carries his crusade to some diabolical levels himself in order to bring Spider-Man to justice, funding projects like the first Spider Slayer robot. Jameson is also curious as to how Peter is getting all those photos of Spider-Man, and he hires a private investigator, Mac Gargan, to find out. Gargan fails, but Jameson makes further use of the less than scrupulous PI and hires him to take part in an untested experiment offered by Dr. Farley Stillwell, who turns Gargan into the Scorpion and sends him after Spider-Man once again. But does any of this give Peter second thoughts about working for such a monster? Or that maybe he should start looking at a rival newspaper or a different line of work with a boss that wouldn't threaten to murder him as a sideline? Hell no. He keeps feeding Jameson these photos, and Jameson keeps making his life more difficult. Because either consciously or subconsciously, there's a part of him that believes he deserves punishment. And who better to deliver that punishment than a middle-aged man around the same age as his dearly departed Uncle Ben? Peter is still not worthy, and he gets the father figure he believes deep down he deserves. So let's talk about the villains. After all, a hero is only as good as their opposition. Many of the best villains are a projection of the hero's inner psyche. They are the hero's dark half, the flip side of the same coin. Whatever the hero stands for, the villain often stands for, but in an opposing way. Often the hero and villain will have things in common, could almost be one another if the circumstances were altered or reversed. So it's no surprise that Spider-Man's villains are often scientists themselves. Norman Osborn, head of Oscorp, is exposed to chemicals which enhanced his strength and altered his mind, transforming him into the Green Goblin. Dr. Otto Octavius is a scientist who invents mechanical arms and assumes the identity of Dr. Octopus. Dr. Kirk Connors is a genetic biologist whose research on how reptiles are able to grow new limbs experiments on himself to replace his missing arm and ends up turning into a humanoid lizard monster. Do you begin to notice a theme? No, I'm not talking about the fact that they all dabble in some aspect of science. We already covered that. Observe closely as we take a closer look at a few more of Spider-Man's early villains. Max Dillon, aka Electro. Adrian Toombs, alias the Vulture. William Baker, aka Flint Marko, better known as the Sandman. Quentin Beck, also known as the Grand Illusionist Mysterio. Do you see it now? They're all green. I don't know if this was done intentionally, but green is the color of envy, jealousy, everything Peter would have felt and repressed early in life from those kids who bullied him throughout his years in school. Kids who still had their parents. Kids who reminded him every day that he was lacking, that he was less than they were because of his circumstances, habits, and interests. Talk about battling your own demons. What did we say about not being able to run away from your problems? In the guise of Spiderman, everything Peter has ever loathed about his life or himself has become manifest and tries to kill him on a regular basis in the form of those villains. All twisted forms of his inner psyche, his darker repressed side, or what he might have become if he allowed his guilt to metastasize into anger. Call it a modern take on mythology or science fiction. I don't know if it was all intentional or if some happened organically, subconsciously, but when you have the fundamental building blocks in place, ideas often form a logical chain throughout our own observation of human behavior. Likewise, all those little touches by Stan Lee and Steve Ditko ring true within our own psyche as we see those stories play out. Some of the symbolism is strikingly obvious, even garish looking. Other aspects are subtle and delve down into the layers of subtext. But there's a logic at work, and this logic suspends our disbelief, holds our attention. I hope this has given you food for thought in organizing your own story psychology. Keep those keyboards clacking.